The Neighborhood Project was a trio of site-specific public art performance events that explored, through the lens of art, Burlington's urban places. It focused on the city's inhabitants, their homes, their gathering places, the memories shared and those uniquely individual, and addressed the question, what makes a vibrant neighborhood? Part 1 was performed the month of April in the Burlington Square Mall, which is on the site of a neighborhood that was demolished in the early 60s urban renewal to make way for commerce. In that performance, we remembered and paid tribute to that lost neighborhood. In Part 2, we welcomed the return of affordable housing to the downtown core and prepared the space for our new neighbors with a fanciful piece in the windows of what had been the Huntington Hotel across from City Hall Park. Part 3 of the Neighborhood Project spotlights the importance of neighbors, including the corner storekeeper, and the significance of simple, thoughtful, everyday actions.
I'm Hannah Dennison. I'm the choreographer and director of the Neighborhood Project video that you'll be seeing after this interview. And with me are a few of my collaborators from this project. And maybe we can get a little introduction starting here.
I'm John Thomas. I was a historian. I did research on the project, and I was one of the narrators.
Okay, and I'm Pete Sutherland, and I was asked to compose music to go with this piece.
And I'm Evelyn Carter, and my responsibilities involved working with John on the narration, and my part of that was reminiscences from earlier years about neighborhoods and little stories.
I'm Rob Coyer, and I was the videographer and co-editor.
I thought that it might be a good idea to just give a little context for this project before we get into details and challenges and questions that we might have tackled as we did this. The Neighborhood Project was part of a series of site pieces that I have done and will continue to do in Burlington, which is my hometown. I do site-specific work in large part because I find that I learn more when I have history to feed from, and when I get to work with buildings that inspire me or landscapes that inspire me. So the Neighborhood Project really began when I started visiting other neighborhoods and other cities in New England through the program that was put together by the New England Foundation for the Arts. And I noticed as I drove around or walked around other cities that many of the people who lived there started seeing their own cities with a new set of eyes because of these visitors who were in their city, who were saying, oh, look at that, or question about this, or that kind of dialogue would happen. And I thought to myself, well, when we live somewhere, we oftentimes just forget that there are little unique corners, and we don't take the time to look at things. So that's what I wanted to do with the Neighborhood Project. I really wanted to unveil some of the history, and I wanted to look at some of the architecture and hear some of the stories, and to enlarge the citizens of Burlington's understanding of their own city. So that was the seed. And I started working in the studio with Rob, and in a year ago. A year ago?
Yeah.
Was it a year ago? Mm-hmm. More than a year ago, we worked in my studio for a while and created some seed material. And that was a big challenge for both of us. Mm-hmm. It was the first time that I'd ever been in my studio with when I'm creating something with someone else.
And a camera.
And a camera. It was really, and I felt very safe with Rob, which was great. I didn't feel that there was going to be any, he almost, at times he disappeared, and at other times he really became a dancing partner, which was great.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask a question, Hannah?
Yeah.
So when you say seed material, Rob was videotaping you dancing,
That's
creating movement.
That's right. Yeah, improvisation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk at all about what that was like for you?
Yeah, for me that was a completely new experience as well. Because I come from, well, I come more from the film background where you set things up beforehand and know exactly what you're shooting, and it was all, it was, you know, you were dancing improvisationally, I was capturing it improvisationally too.
Yeah.
So that was an interesting experiment, you know, and it, yeah, and over time I think what I learned to do was to move with you and to kind of be more of a part of it.
So that was Rob's and my beginning there. Actually, we had a little bit of an earlier beginning. I was a teacher at the high school at Burlington Tech Center Performing Arts Program, and Rob was a student of mine. And then he went on to become the first film production department graduate from the Burlington College, and also was a help in a previous project that I did, and was a videographer on one of the months that I was on the waterfront, and also helped me with editing at Channel 16.
I'd be interested in hearing about the next step then. After Rob had videotaped you dancing, then how did you use that videotape in developing the piece?
Well, I wanted to do a little what was called sneak previews for people who might be interested in helping to fund my work, and also people who might be interested in just kind of knowing what I was up to well ahead of time. And so we took the material that I did in the studio and made a little short 10-minute video of that material here at RETN. And we did these little showings with John, and Evie, you were at one of those showings, or two, but John was talking about history and the history of Burlington, and there was also a slideshow of photographs of Burlington and buildings and things that I'd just been kind of thinking about, and John and I had also seen on numerous walks that we took for about a year before this project started. And so that's where the video came in, and then what I did was to take that information that Rob had captured and start to pull it apart so that I could actually make it into dances and teach it to dancers. So that's what. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
And so then I went to a performance at Christmas time, and there was Pete and his wife Karen, who I've known since I moved to Burlington. We used to separate pounds of
Turkish apricots.
Turkish apricots and honey, and in the bathtub.
Yeah.
Honey was in the bathtub, and pinto beans when we
they
were
in there too.
part of the co-op. And I was so taken by the music that he and Karen were doing, and the emotional quality to what they expressed, that I asked him if he might be interested in working with me on this project.
And it was.
And he said yes.
Very much.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I've been a fan of Hannah's too. I have a growing appreciation for people that are like Hannah, that are committing themselves to telling the story of a place, in this case Burlington, that are really going back to that source and that inspiration and that story over and over, no matter whether it's through film or dance or poetry or prose or historical narrative or music, of course. And I live in the music world, but I have a nice chance to take off the blinders every once in a while and look and see what other people are doing through other media. So I felt like the potential for collaboration was strong, and I'm increasingly interested in moving outside my own general media through which I express, which tends to be folk music, folk song, dance, traditional dance, and that sort of thing, and focusing maybe on something else which impacts on a different level artistically. In this case, to find some lyrical sorts of themes that would work for what I, at least from the start, perceived to be the kind of the point of this piece, the mood of this piece.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went away, and I went to one rehearsal. And where they were, of course, moving to no music, I think,
That's
at that
right.
time.
No music, just me yelling.
So that was nice, yeah, right, which I can easily tune out. Not just you. Tune anybody out yelling. I'm a parent, so
Yeah, right.
I hear a lot of yelling. But and then I just sort of took a few mental notes and actually took a video away of this event. But I went far, far away to a warm country and had the self-assignment to come up with some themes based on my memory of and feeling of this piece as it was laid out. And so I came back with that as my seed, and was very lucky to put together right away a small core group of musicians and singers with Liz Thompson, who's the director of Social Band, who I sang with, included, and her husband and Bill, and Hannah's partner Dave Severance, an accordion player, and some other local folks. And we came up with a very, I thought, bare bones instrumentation for some of these themes. It was not overly developed, and I tried to pick up on something that Hannah said really early that she favors, which is a fairly, I'll be putting the wrong word to it now, but you know and I know what you mean. It's a sort of an unelaborated, an unadorned, maybe would be a good word, expression, one dancer or one singer or one musician, and hopefully it kind of maintained that unadorned quality for at least the first phase in the mall.
Yeah, in the mall, the first part of the neighborhood project, which is obviously the first thing that you see on the video, the small band, and you only really see just a glimpse of them in the video at the end as they're disappearing down the hallway. But they were 2 violins, accordion, and a mandolin player, and then 3 singers. And the rawness of that music for part 1 was really appropriate as people were madly shopping, and we were dancing in this gray environment where there once was a neighborhood.
It had a very haunting quality, parts of it, and I found myself driving to the grocery store, and here's your music, and I can't get it out of my head.
That was the mood that was called for.
Yep.
I think for that phase, which was very sad. I think the other piece that was, I have to mention now, it seems like ancient history, but the whole bombing of Kosovo thing was happening all during that time of rehearsal and performance back then. We all remember that, and that was really on people's minds a lot. And I think the heaviness of our subject and that as a backdrop, and people being displaced, from their neighborhoods, it was a trigger to hear music that was, in this case, kind of ethnically oriented, ethnically derived, kind of quasi-ethnic. I didn't want to touch on one particular, which was in keeping with the neighborhood, as John has said, this multi-ethnic neighborhood, and so I was trying to aim down the middle, and I feel like I hit it pretty well there. And a lot of people said that they'd made the same comment. The haunting part. It was we were kind of set up to be haunted from the get-go, the whole creative process when it was happening.
Evie talks in the first part a lot about her own memories of actually living in the urban renewal area on
Pine Street.
Pine Street when she was first married. So all of what she says at that time are actual memories of her life there. And it must have been interesting for you to be there saying these memories. Can you thought?
It was fun going back, and I found myself remembering more and more little things that I couldn't include in the piece, but it's interesting. Memory is interesting because you recall some small incident, and then it leads little pathways to other things, little visions and pictures that become very special. Mm-hmm. They're all there in your head, but you haven't thought of them for 50, 60 years, whatever, you know.
John's role in part one was very choreographed, wouldn't you say?
Edited, yeah.
Yeah, and you were
the straight man.
You were
I was
restricted.
that's right, the straight man.
He was very restricted. You had a script. You had to say this at this time and that at that time, and no improvisation. Whereas in part two, you had a bit more leeway, and in part three, you really took the ball and ran with it. That's what I heard.
Really? Is that Evie talking again?
She's telling tales.
Yeah, well, that's true. It did kind of go in that direction.
As a historian, it must have been really interesting for you to do some research and then hear from the people on the street their own stories, because history is just a bunch of stories.
In preparing for part one, well, from when you and I walked around town, I think that we might have been some of the last people to visit the Marola store when it was still owned by the Marolas. And I remember standing in there and finding out within a week that it had changed hands, which was interesting. But one particular thing I remember in part one, setting up the houses in the mall in front of the Gap. This might have been our third or fourth performance at that point. And an older gentleman was walking in and he asked what we were doing. So I explained a little bit of the story and how we were looking at the urban renewal that took place, and he said that he had lived there. And he said, well, I was the paper boy here for 10 years or something, and he told me the street layout, and it was Cherry and Pearl, and basically he laid out the streets that went through the mall. And it dawned on me that he was still walking his route, in some sense, walking through the mall. And he wasn't the only person. There were other people that would go through and ask, and we would find out that they had lived there. And in a sense, they're still walking streets that are no longer there, or they go through the mall now. So that added a special feeling to the show, to the performance. And but each part one, part two, and part three had a very different feel. Part one felt particularly somber to me, and I always had this sense of commemorating what was there and what so many people seem to not know about.
Yeah.
I was shocked in myself to realize that I was living in Burlington, had moved, of course, out of that area when the urban renewal began, but was very involved in family life and how little attention I paid to that. And it's sort of reminded me that no matter how involved we get in our individual lives, we really need to pay attention to some of these things that happen in our environment. Easy to not notice and get wrapped up in our own world.
Yeah.
Well, that was something that struck me as I would research some of the story through Free Press articles. I found that there were these waves of house burnings and a very obvious attack against some of the renewing crews, the bulldozer crews, or sheds where they were storing salvageable material would be burned in the night. So I was excited about all this information coming out. It sounded like a very tense time, and I imagined smoke coming out of the center of the city core. And I would ask people who lived there at the time, and they didn't know this was going on, or people hadn't heard of it. They didn't know houses were being set on fire, or they would say, "Oh yeah, I kind of remember that now," or the bricks going through so and so's office. And so it's interesting. It seemed very dramatic, but there also seemed to be a large part of the population that was not experiencing it at all.
When I first moved here, which was in 73 or 3, I think it was, I remember burnings. I remember quite a number of burnings going on in the downtown core. Did you
The
grow up
churches,
here?
I did. I grew up in Shelburne, but I certainly remember the church and theater burnings.
I remember the Strong,
Strong
was it
Theater.
the Strong Theater or
Right.
on Bank Street?
No, Strong is where Kinko's is now.
Right.
Courthouse.
But what was there? There was a burning on Bank Street where the Women's
another
Health Center was there,
Yeah.
upstairs, and the Black Cat restaurant.
Right.
And looking back on it, I can't help but think, in my mind, that maybe these burnings were, sort of helpful for the urban renewal effort that was going on there. Anyway.
Yeah.
Well, that was kind of a point that was being walked around, I felt, in the introduction of part 1, where we specifically said, we start here at a place where St. Paul's Cathedral stood and was destroyed by an act of arson. Hannah and I interviewed some of the people who were responsible in developing some of the area, and it was very interesting discussing the fire, the burning of the church, and some of the people that were convinced that was an intentional effort, and people saying no, it wasn't. It was a fluke, and it did set up some shifting of land and enabled a mall to be built.
But in the long run, when you go to do something like this, where there's a history involved and there are people's stories involved, I remember when I did a project 5-6 years ago, the Mill Project, where I first met Evie, and we went around and interviewed a lot of the old mill workers. And before I started doing that, I had my own very personal feeling about working in the mill. I thought it was terribly exploitive and dirty and dangerous, and talking with these people, I realized that everybody has their own story and everybody has their own perspective about things. And in the long run, as an artist, I have my feelings about something when I go to do it, but it has to sort of filter down into being my own feelings and acknowledging and building on top of other people's stories and the way that history unfolds. So.
We stand on the grounds of Old St. Paul's Chapel. This place was the site of a church that was destroyed by an act of arson. We come here to remember, and in this place of memory we can view the landscape of Burlington. The focus of Burlington's 27-acre urban renewal project were the ethnically diverse working-class neighborhoods bound by St. Paul, College, Battery, and Pearl Streets. This area included a close-knit Italian community, in addition to Syrians, Jews, Germans, Irish, French Canadians, Russians, Greeks, African Americans, and the ever-prevalent Yankee. Urban renewal promised too much, moved too slowly, displaced viable communities, and too often caused irreparable community damage. If Americans were to find their own social history preserved in the public landscapes of their neighborhoods and cities, then connection to the past might be very different. Memory endures. Memory is place-oriented or place-supported. From childhood, humans come to know places through engaging all 5 senses. Identity is intimately tied to memory, personal and collective. Urban landscapes are storehouses for social memories. When science made us masters of the universe, we began to favor vision over the other senses, believing above all that seeing is believing. For that reason, we expect a place that looks good and normal to be good or normal. Yet despite our attempts to be rational, we instinctively understand that every place has a feel.
In 1947, when Jim and I were married, we moved into 53 Pine Street. And our second-floor apartment had a wide porch across the back toward the lake. We were right beside Converse Elementary School. And when I used to hang out my laundry, I could look down into the tall windows and see kids sharpening their pencils. Behind the house, Mr. Salvo had a wonderful vegetable garden with some flowers too. I don't think any bug lasted more than a day with his tender care. I can still see him sitting on his bench of a summer evening with a hose, just gently swaying from side to side, watering his garden. I think it brought him great peace of mind. I remember a parade in honor of Our Lady of Mount Carmel that started and I think ended at the Cathedral of Immaculate Conception. At the head of the parade was a large statue of the saint, decorated also with garlands of flowers. We didn't have a car, but you could walk to just about anything you needed downtown, even a hardware store, 5 and 10 cent store, as well as a theater, doctor's offices. If I ran out of something, I could always throw my jacket on and run up to Izo's store on the corner of Pearl and Pine and find everything I needed, including usually a good joke or two. Bernardini's Cafe was a bar where you put salt in your beer. It was as raucous and sad as a Toulouse-Lautrec poster. Mr. Bernardini had a funny, friendly Roman nose and welcomed families whose fathers drank too much, whose mothers relaxed for a bit while the kids wandered looking for peanuts, potato chips, and each other. Sometimes a family wedged in a booth was the closest they ever got, loud as healthy sinning and as regular as Saturday night. It was my first local. "They're taking Bernardini's out," the man said, and Betty went down the street from work to watch. Bulldozers lined up on the Lake Champlain side and just kind of pushed the gaiety and sadness out of existence. Even Betty, quite unsentimental in these things, and with about 2 decent memories from the whole block, felt something unusual happening.
Home. A place where one lives. Family circumstances. Native land. Institution caring for people or animals. Place where things originate, are kept, is most common. Synonyms include abode, habitat, residence, quarters, dwelling, asylum, domicile, and house. Architecturally, the house is distinguished from other human habitations by its being fabricated, as distinct from caves, more or less permanent in location, as distinct from tents, and relatively substantial in construction, as distinct from huts and shacks, without being monumental, as distinct from palaces and pyramids. Domicile is the place or country in which a person makes his or her permanent home, and to which he or she always has the intention of returning when absent from it.
Is there anything here to learn again and again? We deposit our money where tomatoes ripened, warm and luscious in the sun. Snake our way into the shadowy parking garage where children sharpened pencils, learned to find the area of a rectangle. That everything changes is the basis of truth for each existence. Without accepting the fact that everything changes, we cannot find perfect composure.
Part two and part three were really different than part one. We've talked a lot about part one because it was so history potent, I would say. Part two was really different, and you had a very different. We all had huge challenges.
Right. Yeah, I still haven't seen part two. That's sort of the ironic thing. That I'm looking forward to it because we were inside it. The challenge was really to come up with something I felt that would carry on the music, which we did, but develop it in another setting. First of all, the audience was watching us like in this building, as if watching a gigantic, fantastical movie sort of thing, or something, or TV. I don't know what.
Or peeking into windows.
Or being voyeurs or something. That came up a lot. But and the band was part of what was being peeked at. We were just standing inside a window playing, and not that visible, and yet being broadcast through sound. And,
This was in the building right down in the downtown core, and right across from City Hall Park, which is now called Park Place. Used to be where the Bagel Bakery and the bus station were, and
yeah.
so the band was in one of the rooms, one of the apartments.
Right. My conception of it was that we were really kind of a radio playing for everything else going on. And I'm not sure if it comes across that way, but we all took that as kind of our mental note to kind of be playing on that wavelength, as it were. And then I just kind of got this idea. I was just imagining watching the piece and what would I want to hear, what would sort of make sense, using the themes that we had, which were, my image of the band in the mall was this little kind of ethnic band from some little mountain town in some country in Europe whose descendants had landed in Burlington, in this neighborhood. We weren't sure what country, and it didn't matter. It was some mythical country. But the downtown piece, that really wasn't going to work in my mind. It had to be more urbane, so we doubled the size of the band.
And plugged yourselves in.
Plugged ourselves in. We had bass and drums and piano, and it took on this jazz element immediately. And that inspired me to compose develop some new musical themes to go along with it. So it really took, I guess a quantum leap is a good term, I think, musically. Not that it was better, but that it really just went somewhere immediately. And I feel like, regardless of not having seen the finished product yet, but being sort of in it and part of it and getting feedback from people, I feel like that was a good way to go as well. And then it just, again, I wanted to go out, in my mind, I wanted to go outside and watch it and listen and feel that in that setting on a nice summer's night in Burlington with honking horns and fire engines in the background and things like that, which did occur and which we can hear on the tapes that we made. It's really, it was in the moment that it would make sense.
It certainly presented video taping challenges that the first part didn't.
Sure did, yeah.
Yeah, one of the challenges was trying to be able to videotape people through a tiny little window.
From a distance.
From a distance that if you move 5 feet or 10 feet this way or that, you lose half their body. That kind of thing. Which it was difficult. But and then the other thing was that we, when watching the footage over, we realized that the footage we'd done inside of the rooms during the dress rehearsal was in some ways more engaging and more expressive because it was much closer up and it was lit better and had just a much more of a expressive feel to it. But that the footage from outside was essential for the to give a sense
context.
Of a context of what was going on, right? Not necessarily what the dancers were doing, but more about the experience of the event, kind of.
That was certainly the challenge of when we went to edit that film. How can we give people the feeling of part 2, where the audience was outside on these busy streets
Right.
at 9:30 at night on June night, and the performers were inside, and they were all disconnected, like Pete's experience. They were all in their own apartments with their door closed, and so luckily Rob was smart enough to take long shots away from the building, medium shots, and so we worked our way in, and then we were inside, and then we came back out, and we changed rooms, and we did this back and forth in the video that hopefully can give you the essence of what people were doing in that room. It certainly was a challenge for me as a choreographer and a director, because I had an extremely short turnaround time to work with people. I didn't leave my studio for 3 solid weeks. People would come to me, we'd work for 2 hours, and they brought their own ideas about home and what was current happening in their lives, and that's what we worked from. And in each of the rooms was totally idiosyncratic, and some of the rooms are solo, some of the rooms are group, and yet that it worked, because in that in a building like that, where it's an apartment building, everybody's lives are separate and different, and there are all kinds of things going on, and it was very real. And I think one of the challenges in the for Evie and for John, Evie got herself a microphone or a megaphone. We didn't want to amplify her.
My idea.
But it happened.
I know.
You had no choice.
Megaphones happen.
Megaphones happen, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I had to get my stories, my reminiscences from the histories that John found in the newspapers and so on, and I just loved the finding out that City Hall Park, even back in the 1800s, was a source of great discomfort for some people. At one point, people were bringing carpets and so on into, and laundry into City Hall Park on carts, and stringing up cords and hanging up their stuff, and beating rugs and drying laundry. And there were people writing to the newspaper very incensed that this was going on. So what's new? I mean, but that was fun, kind of making, taking some historical information that John found, and then converting some of it into a little personal, pretending I was someone who lived at that time and I was complaining or enjoying.
Evie has a very strong theater background, performance in theater, right? Is that correct?
Well, somewhat.
Somewhat. It's somewhat correct.
Or somewhat strong.
It's somewhat strong, or somewhat background, or something like that. But here was a challenge for Rob and I when we came to do the video. What she was saying on the site didn't translate when we came to do the video. It just was out of context, and it needed to be, you needed to be there to have that make sense.
Yeah.
So you don't hear Evie at all. We completely cut her out of the picture in part 2.
I may sue.
Yeah.
Well, that's also because of just how much was going on, too. We had to cut out a lot of the narration because there's just so many rooms and so much, and it was so fast-paced, and I was sort of going in and coming out, and there wasn't really much space for...
Yeah, that show reminded me of a total happening. There's an old-fashioned word, but it was like there was a whole bunch of kinds of performances going on simultaneously. Obviously, visually there were, and to document that, I just can imagine, sort of like making 3 movies at once or something, or having 3 scripts to film with 1 camera, 3 or more.
Well, and it was fun because there were some adjacent apartments that people had already moved into, and you could see them in there preparing a meal or doing whatever. They looked as if they were part of the performance.
show.
It was really fun to see that happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that happened in part one, too.
Yeah.
I
It
think
did.
to set that up, I have people walking through to the FedEx office or whatever, and they were as interesting to watch sometimes.
Yeah.
Well, you like that.
I do,
You
I do like that.
It's
It's
part
one
of
of the
what you
reasons.
like about the public space.
Public performance spaces, yes. It certainly, you can choreograph yourself till you're blue in the face, and you can never have thought of that as being unimportant. I mean, the woman who walked through, or the little child who ran up to the house, or somebody who's sitting in their yard. In part three, we had a woman who was extremely worried about this neighborhood kitty. And the kitty was a wanderer. And so actually, I don't know whether it happened during a performance because I wasn't paying attention to that, but during one of the dress rehearsals, she was sitting in on her lawn in the back, very quietly, sort of like this, with the kitty, while we were doing our stuff on the sidewalk. And I thought, oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah,
You know,
nice
it's just
tableau.
beautiful.
I have a story about part two that, like Pete referred to it as a happening, and that is all the performances in that particular piece struck me as that. It had a surreal quality to it, and the music, it was very powerful mixing with the weather. It was nice and warm and kind of humid, and there were thunderstorms that moved off to the north, and the people were sitting in the grass looking up at the building. Everybody was in a good mood, expecting something to take place, and it was just great moving these crowds around the building to watch, and cars would come through, jets would go over. Someone leaned in and said, "The seagulls that just flew over the building went in perfect time to the music." So everything had this beautiful choreography happening. But I feel as though I have the best part of the shows because I get to do this research and find out this background of a spot, and then I get to go and see our piece as another piece of the history on that particular location. So anyhow, in part two, I was digging up as much as I could on the Park Place building and watching it develop from, a lot where hogs were kept to a blacksmith shop to this to that. It just keeps growing through the 19th century, and it's this hotel. So by the time we went for our first rehearsal, it was the first time I got to go in the building, and I was so excited because I had been reading about events that had taken place in the hotel, and I wanted to walk around and just look at the place. So everybody was in their own rooms, or people were just showing up, putting things in, and I was wandering around by myself. And I went into a corner room, and it was maybe room 9, looked around, and I was really thinking a lot about the history I had uncovered about the place, and I was kind of getting sucked into the building in a sense. I left there, I was walking down the halls, paying attention to the old decorations from the hotel, and I turned to the left. I went into another room, turning to the left, and I went down a set of stairs, and I was looking at a brick wall along the set of stairs because you could see where old windows had been filled in. Well, I was so absorbed by the changes I was looking at that I forgot that I walked up another set of stairs. I opened that door, and I was staring at room 9 again. So I had thought I went downstairs to another floor, but here I was back at the room that I started at, and my skin crawled. I didn't know what happened, how it could have happened, and just then someone came down the hall. It was kind of like a Twilight Zone. So somebody comes down, and I said, I just went through this thing, and I'm not really sure how I came back here again. And I don't even know if this was a performer or somebody who was already living in the building. And they said, "Getting lost in your own town is a rare experience, and you should never forget this." And it kind of set the mood for all of part 2 for me. It was great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a quote.
Yeah.
This building is located on one of the city's busiest crossroads since the early 1800s. It has been a residence, a stonemason shop, a hotel, a commercial and office space. When it was the Huntington Hotel, situated next to the city bus terminal, it advertised attractive, comfortable rooms for transient guests. Across the street where the Howard Bank now sits was the Van Ness Hotel, and on the other corner where the Hotel Vermont sits was the famous American House. The brick buildings hemming this courtyard were part of the Wells-Richardson Industrial Complex. This internationally prominent company produced chemical dyes and was hugely successful in manufacturing patent medicines popular in turn-of-the-century Victorian America. This presentation celebrates and marks the return of affordable housing to downtown Burlington. 4th of July, 1828, as the sun set and the day's activities closed, Mr. Amzai Young launched his hand-stitched cloth balloon from the American House. The balloon rose slowly but majestically until it caught the wings of the wind, when it took a southern direction and rode sublimely through ether, exhibiting a cloud of smoke and a pillar of fire to light its pathway. It was visible for 15 to 20 minutes to the marble gaze of the astonished multitude gathered on the common. Entertaining spectacles presented in early Burlington were often associated with other events, be they patriotic, such as Mr. Young's 4th of July launch, academic, such as the Wild Men of Borneo performing for the 1850 UVM commencement, or agricultural, such as P.T. Barnum's massive circuses that happen year after year at the close of the harvest season. In that old tradition, this presentation celebrates and marks the return of affordable housing to downtown Burlington.
Let's go on and talk a little bit about part 3.
Right.
And we have a few more minutes to do this, yeah? And so part 3 actually for me was, I was going to, you should have seen the neighborhood project when I first started it. Oh, Lord, Evie knows about it intimately. She was on the planning committee, and it was going to happen all over the town. There were going to be walkie-talkies, there were going to be bus trips and guided this and that, and walking little pamphlets and a command central, and yeah. And then I got smart and simplified, and part 3 at one point, fairly not too long ago, was going to be 7 stores around the town were going to be the focus, and there was going to be a parade from one store through the neighborhood to the next, and we were going to have a flatbed something or other. We got stuck on the truck part because I didn't want to have
Thank goodness.
I didn't want to have horse-drawn because, it's too Christmassy or something like that, and we were going to have bicycles pulling the flatbed with the band on it. Well, luckily I came to my senses.
Yeah, that's just
And that is history. And did it in right next door to my own neighborhood, the store that I'm intimately aware of, the trials and tribulations that he goes through day to day, being a small storekeeper and in this day and age, and also in this little neighborhood that has always been a mystery to me, and also very appealing. The girl streets, as it's called, or the sister streets, depending upon how PC you are. But that was a wonderful experience for me, partly because I got to know my neighbors better by asking them if I could use their front lawn or their parking lot or their driveway or their hedge. And that's heartwarming these days. We all wall ourselves off, and we spend a great deal of time trying to avoid looking someone in the eye or saying hello to them because we're afraid. And so it was very good for me to reach out and have people be responsive to that and lots of people saying how happy they were that this happened in their neighborhood.
Right. They were lucky.
They were lucky.
And the only time that sort of happens, that interaction, is around holidays and ritual, anything with ritual attached, like trick-or-treating or something, and there's hardly any of that. And what you really did was create a new ritual in its own context. I think that's not original with me. Somebody else pointed that out and said, wow, we should do one of these 4 times a year, or at very least we want to do it again next year in this neighborhood. And then somebody from the north end, where you had been going to do something, got wind of that and said, how come she didn't do one out in our neighborhood, and why can't we do this here next? The importance of it, the connections that I think that you sensed and that everybody sensed, or just became immediately apparent.
Well, there's a pride too in being in your neighborhood when you get to learn more about it because of the history research, and having people come to your neighborhood and go ooh and ah. It's a wonderful it's a wonderful thing. I certainly remember I was doing my own memory rituals when I did that year-long piece on the waterfront. The first Sunday of every month, I dragged Evie out to the waterfront, and we were out there the first Sunday of every month, and for 2 years now I've been sort of saying, oh, it's the first Sunday of the month. Oh boy, am I glad I'm not out there today, or something like that, and I would remember something that happened. So I hope that memory continues to come back, and that this video will bring some memory back to people who actually were there. And even if they weren't there, we hopefully design the video in such a way that it's a kinesthetic learning experience. You can, maybe if you never saw part 3, you would have memory about your own neighborhood, and it would be personal for you.
$450 million years ago, the warm water Iapetus Ocean covered this area. The skeletal remains and organic debris of the ocean's water life left thick veins of white, lime-rich material that was laid on Burlington streets as gravel in the 19th century. On April 3, 1999, the Neighborhood Project Part 1 began in Burlington Square Mall on the former site of St. Paul's Cathedral. Part 3 begins 875 average steps south on St. Paul Street, the street that reminds us of our point of origin. The first project focused on loss of home, the second is celebration of home, and today we look at neighborly relationships as a cornerstone of community. The same underlying question that has snaked its way through the course of the project remains: what makes a vital neighborhood? Lange Brothers Market opened in 1952. Ed Lange was the 5th grocer to occupy this location. He sold the business and the use of his name in 1985 to the present owner, Phil Verracchione. The Flatiron building is constructed around a small house that was built on this corner in 1872. This neighborhood has had 7 grocery locations with numerous operators over 80 years. Burlington had many basement confectionery operations. Though in decline, basement candy production continued into the 60s, and the homemade sweets were peddled to corner grocers out of the trunks of cars.
My friend Josephine took money out of her mother's pocketbook and bought us candy on the way back to school after lunch. When I told my mother, she said, "I wouldn't think candy bought with stolen money would taste very good." The next time Josephine treated us, I took special care to savor the candy. It tasted just as good as any I'd ever had. In a neighborhood, if you need something quickly, you can borrow a cup of sugar or a rake. But not too often. And I was always told, always return something in better condition than when you borrowed it. Which meant cleaning the rake or returning just a little more sugar. I hope I never have to live without a porch to watch the world go by. A couple of kids roller skating, jerking a little over sidewalk cracks. An old man hunching along with his walker, a companion holding his elbow. A young woman with spiky hair walks her German shepherd and waits, looking at the treetops while he deposits on the grass. Beautiful day. Yes, isn't it? Warm out. Looks like rain later, though. How's your grandmother doing? I love to sit on the porch with a cup of tea when a soft summer rain soaks the earth clean and there's that citrus smell of wet grass and wet leaves. Our porch was shaded with a pipe vine that grew thick with large leaves in summer, and I could lie in the hammock in its shade and read. This neighborhood is one of the few that still has some yards without fences. When I was a kid, we found our own passages across the corner of a backyard, along a footpath, over a fence or under, and through an empty lot.
Several small orchards seen in this neighborhood are a minor echo of past agricultural uses of this space. Home orchards were encouraged in the 19th century not only for their fruit production, but for their moral value. Orchards were said to teach children to love their homes, to not steal, and to recognize the divine in nature. Orchards were also said to stabilize marriages, foster good relations between neighbors, and bind communities. John Roberts began building houses in Burlington in the 1880s. He built attractive, affordable homes for predominantly blue-collar workers that are noted for their decorative Eastlake-style touches: sidewall diamonds, geometric ornamentation, front bay windows, and a porch. His homes can be seen throughout Burlington. The development of this and other southern neighborhoods offered first-time homes to many second-generation French-Canadian, Irish, and Italian immigrants, who in addition to working on Pine Street were dressmakers, barbers, bakers, weavers, bankers, bookkeepers, chauffeurs, and in 1920, one farmer.